Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, please know you'll be able to access the webinar later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's webinar you have a question for any of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can before the end of today's webinar. And also at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for two $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 2 lucky winners. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is how Uber ATG reduced AWS costs 15% in 30 days. Easy for me to say. Our speakers today are JT Giri, who is CEO and founder of NOps, John Meyer, who is a partner solutions architect in the cloud management tools at AWS, and Nick Cobb, who is senior engineering manager, infrastructure, platform, advanced technology group at Uber. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
JT, I know you've got a great presentation on tap. I'm going to go ahead and put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and let you guys get right to it.
Perfect. Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is JT Giri. I'm the CEO of NOps. Just a little bit of background on myself. I've been migrating companies to AWS ever since EC2 was in beta. And as I was migrating these companies to AWS, most of these organizations needed our help to manage them. So I started a consulting firm called nClouds, which is a premier AWS consulting company. And NOps came out of that consulting firm. I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. I also have Nick Cobb with me from Uber. We've been working with Uber for almost 6 months. Nick, do you want to maybe do a quick intro, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Been at Uber about 6 years, started on mobile engineering, and have moved over to the advanced technologies group in the last, I guess, maybe about 3.5 years ago. We started building infrastructure and doing sort of CI/CD DevOps work, and sort of been moving forward ever since. I have a bit of a background in building sort of niche data center environments and using on-premise for Mac Minis and GPUs and things like that. So, you know, doing the cloud was one of those things that I actually could borrow from the larger community. So it's been great to work with JT.
Perfect. And also we have John Meyer. I actually knew John. Actually, John was using NOps before he started AWS, and he's been doing some incredible things. John, do you want to do like a quick intro?
Yeah, JT, thanks. So as JT said, I'm a partner solutions architect for cloud management tools at AWS. I'm an evangelist for all things AWS and passionate about educating, teaching, and connecting with others about new and existing services that AWS release. So I'm happy to be part of this webinar. Thanks, JT.
Sounds good. So just real quick, Nick, before we get started, just for better context, I don't know how many people know what Uber ATG is. It would be great if you could maybe just give us a little bit more context on what is Uber ATG is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So most people are familiar with Uber. You've used the app for Uber Eats or ride sharing, or various other services that we provide, like Uber Health, things like that. But Uber has an R&D group focused on self-driving transportation, and that group is referred to as ATG, or the Advanced Technologies Group. And really our goal is to bring self-driving transportation to everyone and everything. We try to introduce self-driving technology to the Uber network so that we can transport people, goods, etc., very safely, efficiently, and obviously increase the affordability and access to transportation globally. So that's our goal.
Yeah, I've actually been to your office, and you guys have that copter in the middle of the office. It's pretty cool, man. It's pretty.
Yeah.
A lot of fun
You're
projects.
referring to Uber Elevate, which is one of our cool programs. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool. And I think everyone knows AWS. That's why we're here, because the topic of this webinar is to reduce cost. I'll just quickly maybe talk about NOps for those of you who are not familiar with NOps. As I mentioned, NOps was born out of our consulting firm. A couple of years ago, we already had about 30 DevOps engineers making changes on our AWS environment. So our goal was try to build a solution which could help us to manage not only cost, but also security, performance and reliability and operation excellence, like the whole 5 well-architected pillar in a dynamic environment where so many people are making changes, and all these people are making rapid changes. So our goal is to help companies to build or manage AWS spend and other well-architected pillars in dynamic environments. So just to kind of go over what we are trying to achieve in today's webinar, some of the topics we'll be covering: how Uber ATG, some of the tactics they use to optimize their cost. I'm pretty sure these tactics, pretty much everyone could probably apply them in your organization to reduce cost, and we'll also be sharing some additional content and just some next steps how you can reduce your AWS costs. So Nick, this topic is very timely. Everyone is trying to reduce costs on AWS right now. So how did you guys do it, man?
Yeah, well, hope everybody's staying safe. So I think for us, using NOps and the tool set that it provides, as well as having a tagging strategy and some of the other things that we'll talk about here, we were able to really go after kind of a lot of low-hanging fruit, but also like the more complex and kind of future long-term thinking cost and efficiency things that we're interested in. Uber has sort of been through data center transitions for years and does build large-scale data centers, and so we regularly look at things like total cost of ownership and stuff like that. But for ATG, where we don't always know, what problems we're solving, we're doing research and development, and we're not sure, always how to solve a self-driving, use case. We definitely need flexibility of public clouds like Amazon to be able to prototype and understand, less sort of build those solid architectures on well-established APIs, but spend more time on application logic and things like that. So we decided to make a move more towards cloud native a few years ago, and so we've been looking at every way that we can really leverage what's already built there, so that we can go focus on kind of the harder issues for us.
Right. I think a lot of the conversation we had, Nick, was one of the tactics that worked for you guys was to identify the top, the most expensive services for you guys, the EC2 and S3 and RDS. How has that helped you to kind of like tackle reducing costs?
Yeah, so we primarily we run quite a few bursty workloads, and so a lot of the stuff that we run is batch compute. We have some sizable long-running service footprint, although that microservice architecture is considerably smaller than what the larger Uber company runs, and some of the organizations who are attending the webinar might have as well. But for us, basically renting computers or EC2s from Amazon is kind of the largest, most expensive thing, and usually is for a lot of environments. And so, we have those same expenditures where we're essentially running our compute tasks on EC2. We're storing our data in S3, and then as we build services, we're using things like RDS instances to kind of manage state in our applications. So those are really the 3 most expensive things that we had really to look at and identify. And I think that that's kind of the biggest cost areas for us.
Yeah, so I think the strategy you guys use first, like identify the top most expensive resources or services, and then go after reducing that cost, right? In your case, like you said, it's RDS, S3, and EC2. John, maybe you could jump in real quick. Are those the most common, sort of most expensive services you see when you're talking to customers?
Yeah, those are, as Nick mentioned, those are kind of like the low-hanging fruit. Immediately, those come up to the top. I mean, you're spinning up an EC2 instance, you're utilizing it, and one of the other things that you had on there was like we're talking about Spot or whatever, but the EC2, definitely that on demand. You're spinning it up, you're utilizing it. You know, what are some cost savings? You know, shutting things off. Those are kind of a big thing. But RDS actually plays a big part in this that Nick was mentioning and talking about is, you know, those unused or underutilized resources. That's really where it comes into play, and to reduce some of those, or even just turning off instances that you're not using. So it's definitely a big part, and what we mostly see, as Nick mentioned, the low-hanging fruit, something you can tackle right away and immediately make a cost-saving impact.
Right. And Nick, maybe you could quickly talk about like what are some of the strategies you guys follow to reduce your EC2 spend?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like the ones mentioned here, right sizing and unused EBS volume spot instances, those are definitely kind of some of those low-hanging fruit to be able to understand, what resources you need versus what you're using. Going after EBS volume. So we basically allow all of our developers access to Amazon mostly freely. And so if you spin up an EC2 instance, you attach an EBS volume to it, and you spin that EC2 instance down, that EBS volume is orphaned, and you're paying for that for a particular time. And then we leverage Spot for a lot of the stuff we do. I think most organizations, as I said, renting computers is by far kind of the largest portion of cost. And it's whether you roll your own tool set or, on top of EC2, or you're adopting cloud native solutions like EKS and you're just paying for the compute. For proprietary organizations, you need the compute to build your applications and run workloads, and whether it's developers or customers. But for organizations that are really leaning into cloud native, in many cases, you're using like a managed control plane, and you still have the worker expenses to sort of execute tasks. We really had to, spend time to understand our usage patterns, whether or not we were running lots of long-running services, what are our application architectures like monolith versus microservice, and whether or not we were bursty or using more static type of instances. In our case, we're very bursty.
Yeah, I think, Nick, one of the things that's like more and more common nowadays is like everyone has sort of similar setup where, the whole reason you move to cloud, you want to innovate, you want people to, provision resource and not be bottlenecked by, just resources. So the setup is very similar where, a lot of other organizations are allowing their employees to just, provision new resources. So identifying where you're spending money, and then starting with right sizing, I think it's a great approach before, like, let's say looking into reserve instances and saving plans. If you can just kind of right size and optimize what you have running right now, there are other ways, but I think I totally agree with you. That starting point should be identify the most expensive services, and figure out like if you're using those the optimal way.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, JT, that's actually a good point that you mentioned there. If you jump back to that slide real quick for me, the very first two were actually the biggest things that you could do a cost savings impact in your environment. And I think Nick was right on, like not even, and you mentioned it, not even jumping into savings plans or spot instances right away, but if you can get these under control and a way to monitor them, and I know you're going to talk about it, which is actually pretty cool, and how you show some of that visibility into that one, but if you can take care of these from the get-go, from the beginning, you'll definitely do a lot of cost savings.
Yeah, 100%. In NOps, we kind of, expose this information in a way, we show you based on the utilization, we look at your utilization of CPUs and bandwidth and network IOPS. And based on that, we make recommendations that, hey, you should maybe evaluate this instance type. And that way, many cases, like, if you downsize them, you can actually save a lot of money, especially if they're part of auto scaling group. You can probably update your auto scaling group with the right configuration. That means not only it's going to affect the resources you're running right now, but also as the application scales up and down, the new resources will be also optimized for cost. And there's other things I feel like people don't understand, Nick, we had a lot of conversations around this, right? Especially the network costs, right? The operation and usage type costs. It would be great maybe if you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, that's right. We were taking a look, just kind of talk about the bandwidth utilization. We were taking a look at what we were paying to transfer data between environments and more specifically between AZs. I think this is a big hidden cost that most people don't look at. And, you know, obviously folks who are in need of uptime for their applications are going to span, you know, those applications or the resources running them across availability zones. And if you're not careful, it's very easy to transfer high amounts of data between instances in different availability zones. And when you take a look at that bill, it actually is pretty high. So, you know, depending on your application architectures and your ability to sort of build engineering around mitigating issues in a particular AZ, it's definitely a good area to go look at in terms of what is the percent of cost, you know, that sort of comes with this multi-AZ architecture or even multi-region in some cases. So we've been looking a lot at that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful because, you know, when you, let's say, I think it's so important to look at the cost for like usage type and operation because, you know, when you're trying to reduce your AWS cost, maybe you're just looking at overall EC2 cost and you're not able to kind of see where is the EC2 cost coming from, you know, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, like you said, maybe the cost is because of, you know, the multi-region traffic, and in some cases maybe it's needed, maybe the application doesn't need to be architected like that, right? So looking at the usage type and networking costs and correlating it back to the resources, I think I've also seen a lot of customers able to kind of reduce their cost just by looking at those stats.
Yeah, I know you want to jump back probably to the previous slide also about and talk a little bit about EC2 a little bit more, but some of the other things that we looked at were growth and confidence levels and that kind of stuff. So the reason we care about what the growth sort of rates are and confidence levels is because this helps us answer the question on the right sizing picture and kind of look into deeper cost saving initiatives like utilization or RI purchases. It also kind of helps determine your organization's confidence level in a particular resource. So, you know, how certain are you, whether it's like 0 to 100%, that your workloads will use that same instance in 3 months, 6 months, or a year? So you can kind of take a look at historical data and sort of make that confidence level or that growth estimation. And as I said earlier, the data transfer between AZs, things like that. How much are you spending on EBS? And then for us, like one big thing for us, we spend a ton of money on GPUs. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that I've done on the data center side as well. So definitely care a lot about this. It's awesome if you can figure out a way to gate your utilization, your GPU usage on utilization. And we've been able to do that through some tools that are available in the deep learning community, such as Horovode, and integrations that we have with Horovode for distributed training internally as well. So for us, our cloud GPUs have to be 60% utilized or more to justify the costs. And it's very difficult to get to full 100% utilization of these instance types because in training and this type of workloads, network and storage dependencies are pretty big. 80% is probably the highest optimal utilization that you'll get. But you know, you shouldn't let your developers use a $24 an hour you know, instance if the utilization is below that threshold. So, and I think it's also important to match chips to like the usage needs. The T4 instances, which is the G4 in AWS, are typically reserved for inference tasks. I think NVIDIA calls them hyperscale chips, but you can actually use them for training. And it really depends on your model and this kind of stuff. So the cost of those is about 1/6 of a P-class instance, which is a V100. And you really just have to determine if like wall clock time, you know, how long your developers are waiting for that training to take place or how important it is to your organization, line up with like that savings of, you know, 6x. So it's been important to us as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And one of the other things, you know, I've noticed, Nick, like, you know, people will look at, let's say, their network cost, but they have no idea where that cost is coming from. You know, in your case, I think you guys are sharing like a direct connect link, and a lot of different teams are using it. It's just very hard to kind of see, which team is, costing how much on shared resources like that.
Yeah.
So one of the things we do in NOps, where you can actually look at a usage type on operation, then correlate it with the resources, or you can also look at the tags for those resources. So it kind of helps you to kind of see where that cost is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yep. And in addition, John, you and I were discussing yesterday. You've seen a lot of people with a lot of snapshot cost. Do you want to touch on that real quick, maybe?
Yeah, actually, so Snapshot's a really interesting one that we were touching on in the conversation. It was just out of the blue. I was like, that's another number one of how long you should retain your snapshots. And there's so many different guidelines that you have to follow for your company. It could be that you have to retain like 30 days worth of data, 60, 90 days. But how valid is that data in 30 days? I mean, how should you should take that snapshot, roll it off to S3, store it in something of a least cost, maybe Glacier, then instead of retaining the snapshots. And that's, I mean, if you look at just your screen on one, there's almost a $12 snapshot sitting there. Roll that
Right.
off. Don't retain it for the, as a snapshot thing. Set maybe a data lifecycle. But I really like the visibility that you're showing here on where my main cost is and how long I'm retaining that.
Yeah, John, I think it's very helpful because, again, normally people just look at EC2 cost. And then, EC2 cost is made up of so many things like networking costs and snapshots, CVS volumes. So it's important to kind of see, like Nick said, first, like identify where you're spending the most money, and then look at those services to figure out how are you spending money. And maybe, it's architected right. Like you said, maybe you do need to keep snapshots for a year for whatever reason, but in many cases, maybe you don't, right? So it's important to look at your snapshot costs and see if there's things you could do. And normally those are just configuration changes in your automation, and that will actually help you to reduce costs.
Yeah, and so Nick, was this one of the things that you guys took a look at? Was it something that you made an action upon, or was it something that's on your radar to take care of or set like a roll off or deletion cycle? Did this come up at all in your conversations?
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it. I think for us, the cost of snapshots are pretty low, mainly because a lot of what we use are larger multi-tenant batch systems, so we don't have a ton of snapshots like this. But I think Amazon does a good job of working with you on data classification strategy and things like that, so that if you're classifying your data appropriately, then you're storing it in the right place, and you don't get into a situation where you have critical or legal hold data that's sitting in an EBS snapshot, for instance. So that's kind of the approach that we take there.
Nice, good point.
Yep, and one of the other things, Nick, this idea that you shared with us, right? Just looking at the net monthly recurring cost growth. Do you want to touch on that real quick? Because I think it's powerful. It shows you where are you spending money and where you should focus your energy on reducing costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So a backstory on this, I guess, a little bit is I work with startups a lot, and I was at FedEx, which is a huge, multinational conglomerate before I was at Uber. And I really believe in sort of having the entrepreneurial spirit, even if you're part of a large business like that. And so one way that startups, as JT could probably tell you from InOps, is one way that you measure sort of your KPIs and your growth is looking at compound annual growth rate. When we talk to your board or your investors, this is something that folks really care about, and it's a health metric for your business. But you can apply this to your infrastructure spending. You can apply it to a lot of areas as a health metric. And so what we did was we kind of created a similar KPI that allowed us to track adoption and kind of understand where consumption was heading. And we were able to look at 18 months of past data, which came from our tagging strategy, which we can talk about in a little bit. And sort of look at what is the monthly growth rate of these services, so that we can go talk to Amazon about, hey, we're going to be spending a lot of money in this area. We're investing a lot in this technology or this service because we've got some initiative or project or thing that we're working on that's driving this. And it helps us sort of, go back to Amazon and negotiate, or it helps us to work with them on feature requests and things like that. And really have a really educated conversation about where our resource spending is going to take place. So this has been super helpful to us.
Yeah, I think the reason why, Nick, this is so effective, because there's so many dimensions of AWS costs, right? You have regions, you have accounts, you have tags, you have usage type, operation type, right? Looking at what is growing month over month and at what rate, I think is so powerful. I was actually looking at one of our customers, or we were, trying to help them to reduce their cost. And we noticed like on their spend, their EC2 cost grew by 20%, regardless of, everything they were trying to do, like they were doing right sizing and things like that. But then we looked at their VPC cost, it looked like it was growing, at 60%, 67%. And then we look at those resources and it looked like there were a bunch of just VPC related resources created and no one was actually using them. So I think just looking at information from that angle, it's actually very powerful. You can kind of see where you should focus your energy on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so just to jump on that, JT, I actually like that part of NOps there that shows my growth rate. We were demoing this and playing around with it, looking at really what you were spending. I think it's a great visibility, not only into the services, but you took onto the resources and what was growing or account, how your account was growing exponentially month over month and what it was projected to do. So I know we were looking at some other data and looking at, but I think this does provide a great visibility into your AWS account or accounts and what might be where you can reduce some cost.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like, for example, one of the other customers, we found one of their Lambda was over provisioned and they were spending about like $1,000 for it. And within 2-3 clicks, right, we were able to find that. I think without sort of this growth rate, it's just kind of hard to find those issues because there's so many dimensions to AWS spend, right? So I think that was, we just covered sort of how do you optimize the EC2 cost, and just MRC is something you could look at for all your services. Maybe we can move into S3 cost. So Nick, do you want to share what are some of the ways you were able to reduce your S3 cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Uber has lots of data that we store from sensors on the vehicle and things like that. And so obviously, storage is going to be a big expenditure for us. I think the stuff that was most important to us is what kind of data are we saving that we're not using? Where is this idle data that we're sort of paying a bill for, and can we put a TTL on that to archive it, or pay less money for it if we don't need it in hot storage? I think like creating a data lifecycle and things that we talk about on the next slide actually are super important to this. Looking for opportunities to sort of archive data, estimating storage growth and impact, and turning on bucket policies natively. A big thing that we do is curate a lot of data internally, and we really shouldn't spend a lot of time on that curation if we can use the cloud to do that for us. And so these are some of the ways that we've looked at our ETL strategy and how we store data to make sure we're using it most efficiently.
Right, and in NOps, we actually make it easy for customers to look at, what are some idle resources. So we allow you to quickly filter, like if there's a bucket that there hasn't been a bandwidth traffic, no traffic for like a month or 3 months, maybe it's a good idea to set up like Glacier, like you said, Nick, or maybe in some cases, it was just an experiment and that bucket is no longer needed. But step one is normally identifying those buckets that haven't had any like bandwidth for a while. I think this is also, we also make suggestions based on your utilization type, like, hey, you should maybe switch from standard to Glacier, and this is how much money you can save. I think one thing that maybe a lot of people don't understand, like you actually pay more for Glacier. So if we have some customers where we make recommendations for them to move from Glacier to standard storage because they were still making a lot of calls. So, sometimes customers think that they're saving money by going to Glacier, but you really have to kind of look at the utilization and look at the data and select the configurations based on that.
Yeah, we've been able to take a look at, sorry, I was going to say we've been able to take a look at some of the recommendations here and apply them accordingly. This is why part of the reason we went to Amazon in the first place was the flexibility of these different tiers and being able to pay less for data that we know we're going to store. I think on the previous slide, you showed a great example, like 225 list of infrequently accessed S3 bucket. Amazon has an infrequently accessed S3 tier. So we should apply that immediately, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a pretty powerful statement, Nick, right? One of the reasons people move to cloud is because you can adjust things as needed, right? So, by leveraging tools like NOps, you can actually, adjust costs, especially in times like these, but you do have to kind of analyze your services and your resources, make sure you're configured properly to save cost. John, anything else before we move to S3? Anything you see that customers normally do on S3 that can cost them more money?
Actually, Nick touched on that one, which is really good, is that, classifying data is a big one. Most of the time, people just kind of store it in there and just let it grow. Like S3, there's no end in sight that you can just store, loads amount of data, and they're just having so much there that they're not using. So using the data classification, what you showed on the screen, infrequently accessed, if it's not being accessed on there, what are you doing with, 225 of them. All right, so set a rule in place, a policy to roll that off to even less cost expenditure, things you don't need. Maybe set one to just get rid of the data after a while, so sponge some of it. And that's one of the things where people just drop it and forget about it. And after periods of time, that can grow to a lot where you can see your cost add up over all your AWS accounts.
Right. Yeah, 100%. So one of the other services I see over and over where this customers spend a lot of money is RDS costs. So Nick, maybe you could share some of the tactics you guys applied to reduce your RDS costs.
Yeah, as the slide says, we definitely look at utilization levels. And I think that DB instances are very easy things for instance reservations because they're typically long-lived. They backstate in applications and things like that. Those applications sort of become the solution for years and years for companies. For us, I think we needed to look at whether or not our ecosystem of internal services was growing. And I think right now, even in the current environment, tech is seeing sort of a boom in innovation, and we've seen the Kubernetes sort of evolution in the last 2 to 3 years really have a big uptake in microservice development and architecture stuff. So for us, we've been trying to build essentially that self-service scaffolding system internally, and our developers have really adopted it. So our system is basically Spinnaker built on top of EKS. And we onboarded about 150 microservices in the first 90 days. These were services that didn't exist before. And so this has helped us sort of transition through a re-platform effort, both in moving to cloud and some internal software initiatives. And I think what we could have done better is create scaffolding tools that would help gate some of the over provisioning of DB instances, because developers tend to think about how big their service is going to get, not necessarily what they need right now and what the adoption rate might be. And so these typically get over provisioned pretty easily.
Right.
I got a question actually on that one. Sorry, JT, I just wanted to jump in there. So here's a question for you. You look at these things, right? And you're looking at some of the right sizing for RDS or reserve instances for RDS. Is this just something that you're looking at once? I make the change, I'm done, and then maybe 6 months, maybe a year down the road, I'll look at it again occasionally? Or are you constantly evaluating the environment based off the NOps report that you're looking at on what you should go to or what you should tailor to? How often are you doing this or looking at it?
Yeah, so we actually have 3 engineers dedicated internally to this efficiency effort that we've sort of stood up. And so I look at the reports with their manager and with that team on a monthly basis, basically. And the monthly basis, we work in sprints, so that typically allows us 2 or 3 sprints for new things to get provisioned. And the environment can look very different in 30 days. Uber's a very fast-moving company. So we look at this on a regular basis, and we also have metrics from our internal service mesh that lets us know about like application saturation, traffic latency, that kind of stuff. So we make adjustments based on the NOps recommendation on a monthly basis, and we look at it even more granularly with the services team, on a daily basis. So to make those adjustments in services.
So just like you said, this is just a continuous improvement. I mean, this is not something you just set and forget. And because technology moves so quick, I mean, 30 days is still technically a long time, but you're at least keeping up with it and keeping on track of it for those and managing those cost savings. And that's what really, people really need to do is keep an eye on them and not just go in there periodically.
Yeah,
Right.
it's been important for us to get our hooks in early, and that's why I said something we could have done better is build this into the scaffolding system where we automatically provision the smaller instances first and not let developers have to go do all this manually, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed is like some of the customers will over provision their IOPS and for RDS, but they won't end up using it, and it ends up costing them a lot of money. So we in NOps we actually make recommendations based on the utilization of the CPU and also the IOPS, and sometimes, a lot of times, like you can just actually maybe downsize your IOPS to save money. And one of the other points we talked about, John, yesterday, you mentioned that multi-AZ doubles your RDS costs, right? Do you want to maybe touch on that real quick?
Yeah, so I've seen a number of things where when they provision it, they're like, yeah, I want this multi-AZ. That's pretty cool, and I'm gonna always have this up. But it's just for my development environment. But dev sometimes feel production, but do you really need it multi-AZ at that point? You're utilizing resources that you'll never need in a dev. You're only gonna work on it from 8 to 5 or a normal type cycle where you don't need it on the weekend for that type. And that's another thing that you're showing on the screen is actually the cost of having a multi-AZ environment versus just running on a single AZ and minimizing your cost on that.
Yeah.
Nick, have you run into that at all too?
Not as much, but I think that's more environment specific for us probably.
Yep. Yeah, so we make it very easy for customer to like kind of see which RDS instances are using multi-AZ. In some cases or many cases you need it, or in some cases that's not required. So you can probably reduce your RDS cost by half for that instance if you disable multi-AZ, especially if it's not required.
So
I think
on that, and I just wanted to jump in there, and the reason I did that is I think I like the tool right now that I'm looking on this screen is that I'm providing visibility into my entire AWS account and all my regions, not just I logged into one region, now I gotta go for the cost explorer to kind of analyze that and look at this one. You're providing it a holistic view onto all of the regions and what RDS is deployed and what multi-AZ might be out there and kind of cost savings around it all.
Yeah, and possibly across hundreds of accounts, right? Many companies have a lot of accounts nowadays. So it's just hard to kind of visualize that if you have to go region by region, Perfect. So some of the other things we talked about, right, Nick, is like, in addition to deploying the tool, there's also sort of cultural changes that you have to do, especially how Uber runs things, right? Like you guys are a company about full transparency when it comes to, AWS costs and things like that. So maybe you could talk about some of the, techniques you guys apply to make this part of the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, releasing, the first thing I guess is that all of our cost is fully transparent to the organization. We don't necessarily discuss, the top level budgets and things like that, except with organization leaders, but we do make the NOps tool available to every engineer in the company, the same way that we make AWS available to every engineer in the company. And we use NOps kind of to enact some of those cultural things that JT is talking about. It gives like the engineer visibility into the things that they're spending money on. It gives us the idea of like sort of adoption rate, growth rate, things like that. So what architectures are our engineers sort of finding to benefit them the most? And it helps also like for us to kind of come back and align growth in particular things with business objectives to say like, hey, we're going to settle on Kubernetes as an internal sort of architecture. Let's make sure that we're sort of all leveraging Kubernetes in the same way. And that we're not spending sort of outside of what those particular objectives might be of trying to settle on this particular technology, because we also have on-premise environments where we use the same kind of stuff.
Right. And I know you guys spent a lot of time, implementing a tagging strategy. I feel like I've actually worked with a lot of organizations just because I have the background in like DevOps. That I worked with probably hundreds of companies. I feel like you guys got tagging right. I would love if you can share a little bit more about your tagging strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll sort of pick on John a little bit here. One of the challenges with tagging is that Amazon services, the way they're developed and the way the teams are set up, you have a team that's very specific to that particular technology. And I think Amazon sort of sets a standard for having, particular APIs that a service has to comply to, but they're implemented differently across different teams. And so as we've sort of approached our tagging strategy, the first thing is that we try to implement policies that don't let services get created unless they have a tag. And what we run into is that 80% of the services in Amazon will allow you to deny creation unless there's tags. But there's a 20% or so services that we're working with our account team on that don't allow that denial. And there's good reasons in some cases. In others, it's like the team hasn't really gotten around to doing that yet because they've been focused on features. But making sure that you have a tagging strategy, naming convention is super important. Aligning your tagging strategy with not just sort of the typical AWS recommendation of building one account per team and allocating that spend toward a particular team, but also based on your organization and how it's laid out. And so, JT, I know you got some stuff to touch on about notifications. The notifications have really helped us because one of the things we've automated is like we take the created by tag, which has an LDAP username information in it, and we store that as a tag as the asset owner. And then InOps has allowed us to create basically notifications based on that so that we can follow up on that. So that's pretty cool. And I know you wanted to chat about that.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful because, Nick, I feel like there's always a disconnect between people who actually provision resources and people who actually pay the bill, per se. So I think the way you guys tag, is like you guys attach the user email right on the resource. Now, in NOps, we can actually notify those users directly, right, without like managing like, hey, if this happens, send it to this user and things like that. We can just look at the owners, their email address, and notify them directly. I think that's very powerful. That's one way to kind of provide visibility to employees who are actually provisioning resources, because like I said, traditionally there's a disconnect. Employees actually who provision resources, they don't know if their resources are underutilized, right? They don't know the S3 bucket they created maybe has terabytes of data and there hasn't been any bandwidth cost for like last 3 months. But if you notify them directly, they do actually take actions.
Yeah, actually, I want to jump in there real quick. I think tagging is the most thing that's overlooked in an environment. If you want visibility into your cost, tagging should be your #1 priority. Not only in the AWS console do you get that visibility and sort by tag and where all the cost is, but even in the NOps one, I really like what you did here with the notification, with the owner's email address. I like Uber's tagging structure and what you guys implemented. I've seen customers take months figuring out a tagging structure and how to implement it, but they've implemented it the right way, and they put it in there that everything that's built has a tag and it's tied back to somebody, a department or a resource, and it holds them accountable, not only for it, but you can reach out to them and be like, okay, this guy's spinning up stuff, left and right and leaving it there. Let's make sure that we do the cleanup and the proactive stuff to do it. And I think tagging is the #1 thing that's overlooked when it comes to cost optimization and savings, because that's your visibility into your environment.
Yeah, I think also, I think every organization, they want their employees to experiment, right? But at the same time, there needs to be some kind of ROI, right? If resources are like left running and it's costing money, I think those are the scenarios we're trying to avoid, right? And if you can notify those employees directly, like, hey, whatever you provisioned last week is underutilized, do you still need it? And especially if you tie it into how they actually work, if those tags are coming from Terraform or CloudFormation and you're notifying them directly, I think it's very powerful.
I agree.
Yeah, so I think I just want to switch to maybe demo for 5 minutes, then we'll move to Q&A. So basically, I'll start with the platform and how our approach is a little different, especially when it comes to cost. If you log into NOps, one of the first tabs is like we have a change management tab where you can look at your cost changes, you can look at best practices changes, and you can also look at CloudTrail changes. Since this webinar is more about cost, maybe I'll start with the cost. So when you go to cost change management, you can actually see everything that is changing. So for example, you can quickly see that RDS cost is higher this month, but then you can actually relate it back to see which resources are actually contributing to that increase. So that's so powerful because as we've been talking in this webinar so far, it's not like one-time thing. You kind of have to always stay on top of your the changes and the implications of changes to your cost, and also security and other areas of best practices, right? So you can quickly look at your changes and kind of correlate it back to how are those changes affecting your costs and what are those resources. And just like maybe Cost Explorer, you can look at your cost for AWS accounts, you can look at your regions, you can also look at AWS product cost. And as we were talking about earlier, you can look at the growth rate for these services. So for example, you can look at your VPC and kind of see where is that cost coming from. In many cases, maybe this is okay, this is already accounted for, but maybe there are cases where this was like an oversight and now this VPC cost is up 93%, but there's no one is kind of using these resources. So this is one quick way to kind of look at where is your cost increases coming from. In addition, you can look at your tags. You can look at the tags that come from Terraform or CloudFormation. You can also look at the tags that come from like billing, but you can actually review your tags like you were looking at stock price. You can see which one of the tags are going up and down. So if you wanted to look at, let's say, environment, this is higher 126% from last month. You're able to kind of quickly look at what are those resources, and and then you can maybe start a conversation with your team about those tags.
JT, real quick question on that while you're running that. I see that you the reports and everything. Once I set this up, how often does this run that actually shows me my results? Is it continuous every couple hours, once a day, once a month? How often are the reports really generated to give me visibility into my ever changing environment?
Yeah, it's every 6 hours because that's when the billing is available from AWS. And then you can subscribe to these changes, right? You can get a weekly or monthly report. But we do send the report on daily basis. Like if your week, like if today's Tuesday, if today's cost is higher than last Tuesday, we'll send you that, hey, your cost is going up, and you can also pipe these to Slack. So, going back to our comments earlier, it's more of a continuous thing, right? You want to kind of know how is your cost going up and down so you can take actions based on that.
I know I get my report that says my cost is going down, so I feel good. I get it once a week.
Yeah.
You're tagging them.
Yes,
tagging is working. So same concept for best practices. Like we have a bunch of rules. Some of the rules we were talking about earlier, I had screenshots. Like you can look at your infrequently accessed buckets, and you can not only look at these buckets overall, but you can also look at like buckets that have not had any bandwidth from last 12 months or 6 months. It kind of gives you that insight. But this is where I think NOps is like kind of unique. We track every new change in here. So if you have a bucket which just became infrequently accessed, we log that, And especially if you're subscribing to these in an email, all of a sudden, you're not just looking at this like, hey, you have 622 buckets which are infrequently accessed. You're actually looking at one new change that happened, and get the team involved to kind of figure out like, hey, do you still need this bucket? Can we move it to different storage type? So the platform is more designed for like real-time feedback. And since how we kind of have the platform architect, that you can look at, like, let's say if you wanted to look at test across all your accounts, you can just search for test and then see, what are the changes that are happening in tests, right? If you have a new user that was created, with privileges like admin privileges, you can kind of see that. And especially, things like that are very important. Like if you wanted to look at your production account, for example, you can see all the changes that are happening to in production account. If there are new CloudWatch group in production account, which is infrequently accessed, you can quickly kind of see and take action on that.
So JT, back on that rules thing there, screen, actually, can you go back just one, which I think is really cool how you outlined it. You have basically the first 5 tabs up there. Can you tell us what best practice that follows?
Yeah, so for example, cost, we look at all the cost related best practices. Operation, we have, operation related best practices. Let's say someone created a new VPC, but it has an overlapping CIDR, right? And we know from experience that's going to be probably a nightmare in future if you're trying to do VPC pairing and things like that, right? So it's like real-time feedback on all the different pillars and best practices.
Yeah,
and not only
the pillars, the well-architected framework, which you guys align to specifically in a lot of those cases, and AWS best practices. So I think that's pretty cool that you have them just right there, readily available.
Yeah, and also not only you can zoom in on a particular tag, you can also look at like a VPC, right? Maybe there's one VPC you care about most when it comes to security, and you can create custom dashboards just for that VPC and subscribe to notifications, right? And the notification thing, I think is very powerful how we actually do that, right? If you tag it right, we're able to notify users directly, right? So if like resources are tagged with John at nops.io, and anytime we find a resource which is underutilized, or or maybe S3 bucket with full write access, we start notifying that user like, hey, we detected new bucket, there's a security issues, for that bucket, or there's a cost optimization opportunity for that bucket or EC2 instance. So we're notifying that users directly, so they have full visibility of the implications of what they're doing in their cloud environment. So I think we're kind of running out of time, so let me just maybe move back to the presentation because we want to leave some time for the Q&A. There are a few other resources that we'll share with you guys, some of the blog posts we've written, and there are some recent blog posts from AWS on how you can reduce your AWS spend. I think that these blog posts has a lot of useful information, so I highly recommend reading these. Also, everyone is trying to reduce costs. We're doing our fair share to help. If you sign up for NOps, and when you sign up, you can use the code FCOVID. You can extend your trial from 14 days to 30 days. With that, let me hand it back to Charlene so we can go to Q&A.
All right, great. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for Q&A, but I think we can probably get 1 or 2 questions in here. Let's see, how about this one? Does NOps provide EBS volume utilization metrics also to determine to resize them?
Yes, it does. So
Okay.
we look at also, not only we look at like over provision IOPS, but we look at EBS volumes which are not attached to any instances, or also some EBS volumes could be attached to stopped instances. We identify those as well.
Okay, all right, great. Here's one. For data egress from the VPC to S3, VPC endpoints will avoid NAT gateway transfer costs. Are there any downsides?
John, I can't think of any downside of that, right?
No, I'm not seeing any downsides immediately on that one to avoid the cost. So that's actually, a cost savings as long as it's staying within the AZ or the region. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let's try and get one more question in here. What are security compliance standards such as PCI DSS, GDPR that can check infrastructure against to identify gaps? Can we customize the security parameters to our requirements?
Yeah, 100%. So we have reports like, SOC 2 and HIPAA, but the way platform is built, you can actually create your own dashboard. So you can just drop in the rules that you care about and subscribe to notifications for those rules only. And you can also share those dashboards with other employees if you wish. So yeah, we have pre-built reports, but you can easily create your own reports as well.
All right, great. Well, let's see. Maybe we'll do one quick more here. Let's see. Well, okay. Can we set up no NOps in our own AWS account and use it? Some customers, such as financial services companies, may trust us as their partner, but may hesitate to pump their infrastructure details into third-party companies' NOps AW account for analysis and optimization.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a SaaS solution, but we would love to maybe, collaborate with you on, to address some of the concerns they have. Yeah, if you please reach out, maybe we can figure out some kind of way to do that.
Yeah,
Right.
I can tell you that JT also worked with us to sort of shorten and compress the permissions that NOps originally had when we rolled it out, because our security team had some concerns. So they were definitely flexible on this for sure.
Excellent. Okay, we're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for the question and answer period. There were a ton of questions, so if we didn't get to yours, I apologize, but please know that the folks at NOps they will be getting a copy of all of the questions, so I'm sure somebody from their organization or AWS or Uber will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. So thanks to everybody who did submit questions. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can always go find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, before we do close things out, I want to do the drawing for the two $50 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, our first winner today is Mark P. Congratulations, Mark. And our second winner is Nick L. Congratulations, Nick. We're going to follow up with both of you offline via email to get your gift cards over to you. So congratulations again. Gentlemen, thank you for such a great presentation. Lots of great information, and as I said before, we got a ton of questions. So judging by the volume of questions and the questions that were asked, lots of good information to the audience as well. They got a lot out of it, it seems like. So thank you again for your time. Thank you again for your expertise. Good stuff. Also,
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.
You too.